Formula One's rules have changed constantly, with the regulations rarely remaining the same from year to year as innovations are banned, spending is curbed, and safety standards raised. Most of those changes happen over the winter, but in some cases, the governing body felt action needed to be taken mid-season. In 2020, Formula One teams faced the latest of these with the ban on changing engine modes from the start of qualifying to the end of the race, introduced at the Italian Grand Prix. But there have been many more significant changes over the years. Here's our pick of the 10 most seismic changes caused either by the rules being modified or a new interpretation of the regulations being implemented. And while you're watching, here's a question we'll be looking out for the answers to in the comments below. Which of these rule changes would you like to see reversed? FRIC suspension. After the 2014 British Grand Prix, the FIA issued a technical directive banning FRIC, which stands for front and rear interconnected suspension. This was a hydraulic connection between the front and rear suspension, allowing teams to stabilise the car's platform for aerodynamic advantage. But the complexity stretched beyond that, also allowing some teams to cross-link the two sides of the same axle, and even have some control over all four corners independently. This gave significant dynamic control, impacting the dive, weight transfer, and even the rake levels. While not a new idea, in the years leading up to 2014 it had become an enormously complicated and important part of the performance of teams such as Mercedes, Ferrari, Lotus, and even Minnow Marussia. The FIA felt that the systems were becoming so complex they potentially infringed the famous Article 315 of the technical regulations, known colloquially as the ban on movable aerodynamic devices. The result was a FRIC ban. Radio silence. In September 2014, Formula One teams were told that communication between the pit wall and the drivers would be cut back on the basis of Article 27.1 of F1 sporting regulations, which demands the driver must drive the car alone and unaided. The teams objected, claiming that the complex and still relatively new hybrid power units meant they needed time to adapt. The change was cut back to outlawing driver coaching, with the full-scale ban deferred to the start of 2016. This prevented all but very specific communication concerning basic race detail, safety information and traffic notifications, among others. This lasted just 11 races, and ahead of the German Grand Prix the restrictions were lifted amid widespread derision. What the FIA described as a more liberal approach to the interpretation of Article 27.1 of the sporting regulations was implemented and remains in place to this day. Giant airboxes and a width restriction. At the 1976 Spanish Grand Prix, the fourth race of that season, rule changes agreed 8 months earlier transformed the look of F1 and led to one of the big controversies of the year. Changes were made to reduce the overhang beyond the front wheels to 1,200mm and the overhang behind the rear wheels to 800mm, with the maximum width set to 2,150mm. More on that in a moment. But the visual impact was the new rule restricting the height of the towering airbox structures to no more than 850mm above the lowest sprung point of the car. This eliminated increasingly ludicrous designs, which had culminated with the absurd Ligier JS5. But Spain 1976 is remembered thanks to the disqualification and reinstatement on appeal 2 months later of race winner James Hunt, whose McLaren was found to be 15mm too wide. This was despite the new width rule being based on the McLaren M23 and caused by Goodyear modifying its tyres to a more rounded design that protruded further. This made the car wider by a margin ultimately deemed not significant enough to justify the exclusion. Mass damper. Fernando Alonso and Renault's march to the 2006 World Championship was hit by the FIA banning the mass damper after the 11th race of the season at Manicourt. The mass damper was used both at the front and the rear to minimise the vertical movement of the car by absorbing the impact of bumps and controlling the pitch. This was achieved by suspending a relatively small mass weighing just under 10 kilos between springs. It acted as a counterweight to the rest of the car. The mass damper for the front end of the car was a sealed unit mounted inside the rear of the nose section. The big benefit was that it evened out the variation of front tyre grip when braking and cornering, slightly reducing the theoretical maximum but raising the minimum grip. By evening out the fluctuations in pitch and boosting driver confidence, this was worth several tenths of a second. While Ferrari was itself running a mass damper, it couldn't gain the same advantage thanks to the fact it ran the stiffer sidewall Bridgestone tyres. The mass damper was more beneficial when working with the more compliant Michelin rubber, leading to Ferrari lobbying against it. The mass damper was banned as a movable aerodynamic device as, while contained within the car, it did allow it to be run in a narrower ride height window and therefore permit the running of a more aggressive aeromap. X-Wings. Tyrrell brought the distinctive X-Wings to F1 in 1997. These capitalised on the fact that the various boxes governing where you can and cannot place bodywork left some gaps well above the car. By early 1998, Prost, Sauber, Ferrari and Jordan had all joined Tyrrell's X-Wing revolution. But after the fourth race of the season at Imola, the teams were informed X-Wings had been banned, with immediate effect. The justification was one of safety amid the fear they could fall off and be collected by another car. But the real reason was a far simpler aesthetic one, given the effect they had on the look of F1 and fears such designs could proliferate. It was the Entra X-Wings, although unsightly devices that echoed the idea occasionally cropped up in the future, notably the nose-mounted wings trialled by Arrows and Jordan at Monaco in 2001, that a stop was quickly put to. Tyre width measurement changes. A change in the way the FIA measured tyres to ensure they complied with maximum tread width regulations potentially changed the destiny of the 2003 World Championship. By modifying the way the rules were upheld, rather than making a change to the rules themselves, it dealt a blow to the teams running Michelin rubber, led by Williams and McLaren. With Ferrari driver Michael Schumacher running Bridgestone rubber, just leading Williams driver Juan Pablo Montoya and McLaren's Kimi Raikkonen in the championship, ahead of the Italian Grand Prix, teams were informed the tyre tread would be measured after the race, rather than before, as had been usual. This was to inspect the tyres for any evidence that there was a systematic exceeding of the maximum tread rules during a race, after Bridgestone spotted markings on the sidewall of the Michelin tyres. These suggested that, under lateral load, the tyre width might be wider than permitted thanks to the overhang of the sidewall. Michelin made hurried changes, while Schumacher went on to win the title by a slender margin from Raikkonen. Elimination qualifying. This wasn't the first short-lived qualifying rule change in F1, as in 2005, aggregate qualifying with a driver's best lap from Saturday added to that set on Sunday morning, abandoned after just 6 races. But it was probably the stupidest. On the eve of the 2016 Formula 1 season, elimination qualifying was adopted. This was to satisfy the demands of promoters for more on-track action, and was intended to ensure there were cars on circuit throughout each of the 3 segments of qualifying. To achieve this, the slowest runner was knocked out on a rolling basis throughout each part of qualifying. But the threat of elimination had the opposite effect, and just front-loaded the sessions. This led to the track being quiet at what should have been the denouement of each part of qualifying. The experiment was a disaster, derided by fans and hated by competitors, so lasted just 2 races before F1 reverted to the old system that continues to be used to this day. Traction control returns. Traction control was one of the victims of the FIA's ban on driver aids ahead of the 1994 season, but 7 years later, it was back. A combination of the growing road relevance of such systems and, more importantly, the fact the FIA was finding it very difficult to police the rule, led to the ban being lifted. This was agreed in December the previous year, but to give time to adapt, with Ferrari lobbying for the rule change to be deferred to 2002, it did not kick in until the 5th race of 2001, the Spanish Grand Prix. It made little difference, as Ferrari kept winning with Michael Schumacher leading it to the World Championship, but traction control remained in use in F1 until the introduction of the standard ECU in 2008 made it more straightforward to police. Emergency speed reduction. The deaths of Roland Ratzenberger and Ayrton Senna at Imola in 1994 had far-reaching consequences for Formula 1, but also called for the short-term changes to slow the cars. Many drastic measures were considered, including the introduction of a fuel flow meter to limit power, with 3 phases of in-season changes planned for the Spanish, Canadian and German Grand Prix. The Spain changes went ahead and included front wing changes, raising the end plates by 10mm and tidying up parts that stretched behind the front of the front wheels. Most significantly, the diffuser was also made smaller and not allowed to extend behind the rear wheel centreline with the aim of cutting 15% of the downforce. The other phases of changes, planned for Canada and then Germany, were more extreme and teams pushed back, citing safety concerns. The changes were eventually mitigated. The initial plan to remove the airboxes entirely was replaced by an instruction to eliminate the ram effects that created positive pressure in the airbox to increase engine power, potentially costing around 30 brake horsepower. This proved controversial and led to some weird and wonderful airbox designs, notably the extreme cutaways used by Tyrrell before the rules were tidied up. At Hockenheim, teams had to raise the ride height through adding a 10mm plank made of Jabrock, a special beach laminate, to the underfloor. Wear of the plank led to Michael Schumacher's exclusion after winning that year's Belgian Grand Prix. Skyscraper rear wings. After the first wings had appeared in F1 at the Monaco Grand Prix in 1968, the technology rapidly evolved with a towering skyscraper rear wings mounted directly onto the hubs via spindly pylons, becoming de rigueur. This changed at Monaco a year later thanks to huge accidents at the preceding Spanish Grand Prix at Montjuic Park. After plenty of confusion, the Monaco Grand Prix went ahead with such wing configurations banned. The race was won by Jackie Stewart with a wingless Matra. But by the time of the next race at Zandvoort, new rules had been finalised that outlawed high wings for good. This stipulated that the body, with the exception of the rollover bar, could be no higher than 800mm above the bottom of the sprung structure of the car. The front wing was restricted to the same level, or, if 1100mm or wider, no higher than the front wheels. The rear wing could be the maximum height of 1100mm. High wings were gone for good. Those are our choices, but let us know in the comments below if you think we've missed something and whether F1 was right or wrong to make these changes. And if you haven't already, subscribe for more from the race.